and finished at the rim with a violence that made the backboard shake. At his absolute peak, he was a walking bucket, a man who could get you 20 points in his sleep and look better than anyone else doing it. According to Basketball Archives, Woolridge reached an incredible offensive ceiling during the 1984 to 1985 season, where he averaged 22.9 points per game. That is elite territory. He was not just a sidekick. He was a legitimate offensive engine who gave the young Michael Jordan the spacing and the support he needed to flourish. But today, if you go looking for his jersey in the rafters or his name in the Hall of Fame, you will come up empty. His legacy has been pushed into the shadows, largely because of the era he played in. This was the decade of the gold rush, but it was also the decade of the epidemic. While the fans were cheering for the dunks, a different kind of storm was brewing behind the scenes, one that was claiming players left and right. Television coverage at the time focused on the glitz of the NBA, but it rarely pulled back the curtain on the personal costs of that lifestyle. For Orlando, the transition from being a star to being a statistic happened with a suddenness that shocked the league. According to major sports media reports from early 1988, he became one of the most high-profile figures to be caught in the league's new aggressive crackdown on substance use. That month, the press began writing his professional obituary while he was still in his prime, focusing on a formal suspension that would redefine his public image forever. It raises a question that still haunts his fans. How does a man with that much natural grace find himself grounded by something so heavy? To understand how he fell so fast and hard into the league's disciplinary crosshairs, you first have to witness the sheer elevation he reached on a college court in 1981. Before the Chicago Stadium roared for him, Orlando Woolridge was the king of South Bend, Indiana. Playing for Notre Dame in the late 70s and early 80s, he was the kind of athlete who made college coaches lose sleep. He was too fast for the big men and too powerful for the guards. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, but when he stepped between the lines, he played like he had something to prove to the world. He was part of a golden era of Irish basketball, but his defining moment came in a game that people in Indiana still talk about like it happened yesterday. It was a cold winter afternoon when the undefeated #1 ranked powerhouse from Virginia rolled into town, led by a 7'4" phenom named Ralph Sampson. According to College Basketball Archives, in February 1981, Woolridge did the unthinkable. With the game on the line and the clock bleeding out, he rose up and hit a jumper at the buzzer to secure a 57-56 victory over the top-ranked Cavaliers. That single shot turned him into a household name overnight. He had looked a future #1 pick in the eye and didn't blink. Reporters noted at the time that his poise under that kind of pressure was exactly what professional scouts were looking for. He was not just a dunker, he was a winner. The hype train was moving at full speed, and the professional world was waiting with open arms and a lot of cash. As the draft approached, the buzz around him only intensified. He was seen as the safe bet, the high-floor athlete who could transform a franchise from day one. According to official NBA draft records, the Chicago Bulls decided he was the man to lead them out of the wilderness, selecting him with the 6th overall pick in the June 1981 draft. It was a moment of pure triumph, the kind of day a young man dreams about when he's practicing on the playground. He packed his bags for Chicago, expecting to be the missing piece of a championship puzzle, but he walked into an organization playing in front of thousands of empty seats. Walking into the Bulls' locker room in the early 80s was not like walking into the United Center today. Back then, the Bulls were struggling for relevance in a city that was obsessed with the Bears and the Cubs. The attendance was low, the energy was flat, and the team was losing a lot more than they were winning. Orlando was the bright spot in a very dark room. He was a human highlight film in an era when highlight films were just becoming a staple of the nightly news. He was out there night after night, throwing down dunks that should have been illegal, trying to give the few fans in the seats a reason to come back. But the weight of a losing culture is heavy, even for a man with a 40-inch vertical. According to archived NBA standings, the Chicago Bulls managed to secure only 34 wins during Woolridge's rookie 1981 to 1982 season. It was a grueling introduction to the professional ranks. He was putting up numbers, but they were empty calories because the team was going nowhere. In retrospective interviews, former teammates noted that Woolridge's scoring was essentially the franchise's only reliable attraction during those lean years. He was the one player who could keep the box office from completely bottoming out. By his third season, he had established himself as a premier scorer, with basketball archives showing his average climbing past 19 points per game during the 1983 to 1984 season. Despite his individual success, a sense of isolation began to settle in. He was the star, but he was a star on a treadmill. Television reports from the time often focused on the team's lack of direction, wondering if Orlando was being wasted in a system that didn't have enough talent to support him. There were rumors of frustration in the front office and whispers that the team needed a different kind of energy to truly compete. Orlando was carrying the nightly scoring burden largely alone, and the pressure of being the sole savior was starting to show. He had done everything asked of him, but the city was still waiting for a miracle. They would finally get that miracle on the evening of the 1984 draft. When Michael Jordan arrived in Chicago in the fall of 1984, the world expected the old guard to be swept aside. Usually, when a generational talent like that walks through the door, the veterans start looking over their shoulders, wondering whose touches are about to disappear. But Orlando Woolridge didn't flinch. Instead of fighting for the spotlight, he found a way to share it, creating one of the most exciting, high-flying duos the league had ever seen. If Michael was the Lightning, Orlando was the Thunder. They were two of the most athletic players in the world, running the lanes together and turning Chicago Stadium into a nightly highlight reel. It wasn't just about the dunks. It was about the chemistry of two men who seemed to understand that they were faster and stronger than everyone else on the court. According to archived NBA box scores from the 1984 to 1985 season, this newly formed pairing was a statistical nightmare for the rest of the league, combining to score over 51 points per game. They weren't just putting up numbers in losing efforts anymore either. According to playoff archives, their combined firepower pushed the Bulls back into the postseason in April 1985, finally snapping a painful three-year playoff drought that had hung over the city. Television coverage at the time focused on the new-look Bulls, showing Michael and Orlando as the face of a rising power in the Eastern Conference. Reporters noted at the time that while Jordan was the clear future, Woolridge was the essential present, providing the physical interior presence that kept defenses from collapsing entirely on the rookie. In interviews, Orlando seemed to embrace his role as the veteran co-pilot, often speaking about how much fun it was to run the floor with someone who could finally keep up with him. It looked like the foundation of a dynasty was being poured right there in Chicago, but the high-flying celebration was cut short by a sound no player ever wants to hear. Everything in Chicago's trajectory violently shifted on a cold night in the fall of 1985. The 1985 to 1986 season was supposed to be the year the Bulls truly arrived, but the honeymoon ended almost before it began. Just a few games into the schedule, the franchise's heart skipped a beat. According to team medical archives, Michael Jordan broke a bone in his foot in October 1985, an injury that sidelined the young star and left a massive vacuum at the center of the organization. Suddenly, the co-star was back to being the only star. The pressure shifted back onto Orlando's shoulders to keep the team afloat, but the dynamics in the locker room had already begun to change. Management was already looking at the team through a Jordan-colored lens, and every move Orlando made was now being compared to what the missing superstar would have done. Reporters noted at the time that the atmosphere in the locker room grew increasingly tense as the losses piled up and the front office obsessed over Michael's recovery. Orlando was still producing, still playing at an elite level, but the joy seemed to be draining out of the building. Even when Michael made his legendary return for the playoffs later that spring, the hierarchy had permanently shifted. The team was no longer a partnership of two stars. It was a solo act with a supporting cast. That month, the press was writing about the need for complementary pieces around Jordan, a phrase that didn't quite fit a man of Orlando's caliber and ego. According to NBA transaction records following that tense 1985 to 1986 campaign, the organization made a decision that signaled the end of an era. Instead of locking Orlando down as their long-term secondary option, they allowed the situation to reach a breaking point. In October 1986, Orlando departed Chicago as a restricted free agent, seeking a place where his talents would be the main event once again. Management let him walk away to chase top dollar on the East Coast, but that massive new contract would soon fund the darkest chapter of his life. When Orlando arrived in New Jersey, he was looking for a fresh start and a paycheck that reflected his status as one of the league's premier scorers. He got both. The Nets were desperate for a star to compete with the bright lights of New York City right across the river, and they saw Orlando as the man to bring some excitement back to the Meadowlands. On the surface, the move was a massive success. He was finally the highest-paid man on the roster, and he played like it, proving to everyone who thought he was just a Jordan sidekick that he could carry a team on his own. But the East Coast offered more than just basketball. The late 80s New York area was a playground for a young man with millions of dollars and a taste for the nightlife. According to public contract data reported by sports media, Woolridge signed a lucrative multi-year deal with the New Jersey Nets in October 1986, a contract that made him one of the wealthiest players in the league at the time. He validated the team's financial investment on the court, with archived player statistics showing him averaging 20.7 points per game during that 1986 to 1987 season. But while the box scores looked healthy, the man behind them was starting to fray. As some reports claimed at the time, there were whispers of late nights and a shifting circle of associates that had some people in the organization concerned. Reporters noted at the time that his energy during practices seemed to fluctuate, and the consistent reliability he had shown in Chicago was being replaced by flashes of brilliance, followed by strange absences. One version of the story says the team tried to keep things quiet to protect their investment, but the rumors were becoming harder to ignore as his behavior became more erratic. He was still dropping 20 points a night in his first year, but the internal struggle was reaching a boiling point. The scoring was there, yet just 19 games into his second season in New Jersey, the lights went out and the spectacular offensive output abruptly vanished. In the late 1980s, the NBA was a league caught between two worlds. On the court, it was the era of the Magic and Larry boom, with television ratings soaring and the league finally becoming a global brand. But in the locker rooms and the back alleys behind the arenas, a shadow was spreading. The cocaine epidemic was not just a headline in the newspapers. It was a reality that was claiming careers and destroying lives with a terrifying efficiency. For Orlando Woolridge, the high-flying lifestyle of a superstar in the New York area eventually collided with the league's new, uncompromising stance on personal conduct. The man who seemed to spend most of his time in the air was about to be brought down to earth in the most public way possible. According to major press coverage, the situation reached a breaking point in early 1988 when Woolridge reportedly admitted to a severe substance abuse problem and entered a treatment facility in February of that year. It was a shocking admission for a player of his stature, but it was also a sign of the times. Television coverage at the time focused on the league's cleanup efforts, often using Orlando's face as the primary example of why the new policies were necessary. Reporters noted at the time that the NBA was no longer interested in looking the other way. They were ready to make examples out of anyone who stepped out of line, no matter how many points they scored on Tuesday nights. The fallout was immediate and devastating to his professional standing. As documented in league disciplinary records, he was suspended for the remainder of the 1987 to 1988 season, a decision that capped his time on the court at exactly 19 games that year. He was the first high-profile player to be formally sidelined under the league's updated anti-drug agreement, a distinction that turned him into a pariah in the eyes of many front offices. The story was no longer about his vertical leap or his scoring average. It was about his reliability and his character. Labeled damaged goods and exiled from the New Jersey organization, it seemed impossible that any championship contender would ever risk handing him a jersey again. Rebuilding a reputation in the NBA is often harder than building one from scratch. Once the league puts a certain label on you, that label tends to stick like glue. Throughout the summer of 1988, Orlando was a man on an island. He was working on his health and his sobriety, but the phone wasn't ringing. Most teams saw him as a liability, a distraction that wasn't worth the talent he brought to the floor. But in Los Angeles, Pat Riley and the Showtime Lakers were looking at things differently. They were coming off back-to-back championships and were looking for a specific kind of veteran insurance, a player who could provide a spark off the bench without needing the ball in his hands for 40 minutes. According to NBA free agency records, the Los Angeles Lakers shockingly signed Woolridge on August 10, 1988. It was the ultimate lifeline, offered by the most prestigious franchise in the world. Reporters noted at the time that Pat Riley was taking a calculated risk, believing that the structured winning environment of the Lakers' locker room was the perfect place for Orlando to stay focused. In interviews, Riley mentioned that the team wasn't looking for the Chicago version of Orlando, but rather a mature, efficient contributor who could run the floor with Magic Johnson. It was a tall order, but Orlando responded with a professional discipline that many critics thought he had lost. He spent the year proving the doubters wrong, not with words, but with a consistent presence on the roster. According to regular season statistics, he rebounded to play 74 games for the Lakers during the 1988 to 1989 season, transforming himself into a highly efficient bench asset. He wasn't the focal point of the offense anymore, but he was a vital part of a machine that made it all the way to the NBA Finals. He had successfully rebuilt his reputation in the brightest spotlight imaginable, but the business of basketball is notoriously unsentimental. Despite his successful redemption arc in Los Angeles, an unexpected offseason trade in August 1990 would soon drop him into the most chaotic offensive experiment in NBA history. If the Lakers were about precision and prestige, the Denver Nuggets of the early 90s were about pure, unadulterated chaos. When Orlando arrived in Colorado, he found himself playing for a coach named Paul Westhead, who believed in a system called the system. The goal was simple: shoot the ball as fast as humanly possible, usually within 7 seconds of crossing half court, and don't worry about playing a lick of defense. For an aging veteran who could still run the floor and finish at the rim, it was like being given the keys to a Ferrari with no speed limit. In Denver, the high flyer wasn't just a nickname, it was a job description. According to official trade records, Woolridge was acquired by the Denver Nuggets in August 1990, and he immediately became the centerpiece of their track meet offense. While the team was losing games at a historic rate, Orlando was putting up numbers that looked like they belonged in a video game. Who was around when things started to change in Denver, actively encouraging him to shoot without a conscience? It was a coaching staff that prioritized pace over everything else, and it allowed Orlando to have a statistical resurgence that nobody saw coming. According to archived league leaderboards for the 1990 to 1991 period, he was averaging an astonishing 25.1 points per game, sitting near the very top of the league's scoring charts. Reporters noted at the time that while the Nuggets were the unfair Nuggets, because they had no D, Woolridge was playing with a joy that had been missing since his early days in Chicago. He was 31 years old and outscoring some of the greatest legends in the game. It was a bizarre, beautiful moment of individual dominance that seemed to erase the struggles of the previous few years. He was sitting third in the entire NBA in scoring, seemingly on his way to an all-star nod and a massive new level of respect. But in the middle of this high-octane comeback, a brutal, unseen physical blow was about to literally blindside his career year. There is a specific kind of cruelty in the way professional sports handles a comeback. One minute you are sitting at the top of the mountain, outscoring legends and proving every doubter wrong, and the next, a single stray elbow or a hard collision turns the lights out, literally. In December 1990, Orlando Woolridge was playing the best basketball of his life in that high-octane Denver system. He was a veteran who had found his second wind, a man who had survived the scandals of the 80s and emerged as a 25-point-per-game scoring machine. He was finally being discussed as an all-star again. But in the middle of that historic run, his body finally issued a protest that no amount of willpower could overcome. According to medical updates covered in sports media during that winter, Woolridge suffered a severe detached retina after taking a hit during a physical game. For a player whose entire game relied on depth perception and the ability to navigate through mid-air traffic, it was a terrifying diagnosis. Television coverage at the time focused on the uncertainty of his return, with some analysts wondering if he would ever be able to see the rim clearly again. Reporters noted at the time that the energy in Denver seemed to deflate the moment he went to the locker room. According to archived player logs, the surgery and the long recovery process restricted his incredible 1990 to 1991 campaign to just 53 games. The injury didn't just steal his rhythm, it stole his momentum in the eyes of the league. He worked his way back onto the floor, but the explosive, fearless version of Orlando that had been torching the league was replaced by a man playing with a newfound sense of caution. The front office in Denver, always looking for the next fast-paced experiment, decided that his peak had passed with that injury. That summer, the business side of the game took over, and the high-scoring dream in the Rockies ended abruptly. According to official transaction logs, Woolridge was traded from Denver to the Detroit Pistons on August 13, 1991. By the time Orlando landed in Detroit, the league was changing. The bad boys era was winding down and the game was becoming more defensive and physical. For a man who had built his reputation on pure athletic transition play, finding a home in the half-court grind of the early 90s was a struggle. He was no longer the primary option or the high-flying savior. He was becoming a suitcase player, a veteran presence moving from city to city, trying to find a roster where his scoring could still make an impact. From Detroit to Milwaukee and eventually to Philadelphia, the minutes started to dwindle as his trademark leaping ability and speed finally began to fade under the weight of age and past battles. Reporters noted at the time that while Orlando still had flashes of that old Notre Dame brilliance, the consistency was gone. Television coverage at the time focused on his role as a mentor to younger players, a role he accepted with grace, but it was clear to everyone watching that the high flyer was finally coming back down to earth. According to European basketball archives, after concluding his 13-year NBA run with 74 games for Philadelphia in the 1993 to 1994 season, he realized the phone wasn't ringing with NBA offers anymore. He wasn't ready to put the ball down, so he packed his bags one last time and headed across the Atlantic to sign a professional contract in Italy. Playing overseas is often a lonely road for a former NBA star, a way to squeeze the last drops of glory out of a career while playing in front of crowds that only know you from old highlight tapes. He spent a few seasons in Europe, proving he could still give a team 20 points when his legs felt right, but the distance from home and the toll on his body eventually caught up to him. When the arena lights finally turned off in Italy, he headed back to the States to figure out who Orlando Woolridge was without a jersey on his back. He eventually found a way to stay tethered to the game, but his transition to the sidelines would be just as complicated as his time on the court. In the summer of 1998, a new opportunity arrived in Los Angeles that seemed like the perfect second act. Orlando's return to Los Angeles felt like a homecoming. He had played some of his most disciplined basketball there with the Lakers, and the city still remembered him fondly. When the WNBA was in its infancy, the Los Angeles Sparks were looking for a leader who understood the professional grind and had the charisma to represent the brand. According to WNBA public records, Woolridge was named the interim head coach of the Sparks in the summer of 1998. He took to coaching with an unexpected intensity, proving that he had a deep mind for the game's nuances, not just its highlights. He wasn't just a former star standing on the sidelines. He was a tactician who led the team to a solid 20-12 record during the 1999 season. Despite the success on the court, the old patterns of friction and behind-the-scenes drama began to resurface. Television coverage at the time focused on the Sparks' rise as a powerhouse, but inside the organization, the story was different. Reporters noted at the time that there was a growing rift between Orlando and the front office, leading to a sudden quiet exit that left many fans scratching their heads. According to records of the team's official statements, his departure was chalked up to philosophical differences, a phrase that usually hides a much more complicated truth. One version says the friction was about control, while others argued it was about the same personal inconsistencies that had followed him throughout his playing days. Whatever the reason, the dismissal from the Sparks marked the beginning of a long, quiet period where Orlando was effectively exiled from the professional basketball community. Coaching had temporarily filled the massive void left by his playing days, giving him a sense of purpose and a schedule to keep him focused. Without the structure of the season and the responsibility of leading a team, he found himself drifting. The quiet of retirement can be a dangerous place for a man who spent his life chasing the roar of the crowd. He was still only in his late 40s, but a creeping silent health crisis was already beginning to strip away his independence. In the months following his exit from the Sparks, the first signs of a serious heart condition began to manifest, leading to a medical emergency that would change everything. When the cheering stops for a professional athlete, the silence that follows can be deafening. For a man like Orlando, who had lived his life in the thin air of the NBA, the descent into a normal, quiet retirement was fraught with challenges that the public rarely saw. By the late 2000s, the soaring physical specimen who had once been Michael Jordan's primary scoring option was struggling just to get through the day. He was dealing with the long-term effects of a taxing career and the lingering shadows of his past struggles. But it wasn't just the physical toll that was weighing him down. It was the sheer financial and medical pressure of surviving in a world that had moved on without him. According to statements given by his mother to sports reporters in the year leading up to his final crisis, Orlando had suffered 2 major heart attacks that left him physically unable to hold a steady job. The man who once ran like a deer was now struggling with chronic heart failure, a condition that is as expensive as it is exhausting. Public records showed that by the winter of 2012, his situation had reached a point of absolute desperation. In February 2012, law enforcement records in Louisiana documented a shocking incident where the former star was arrested for reportedly stealing over $1,500 worth of aluminum water lines. Reporters noted at the time that the image of a former multimillionaire being hauled away for scrap metal was a jarring contrast to the Showtime era of his youth. This wasn't a story of a high-stakes heist. It was the story of a man whose world had shrunk to a point of survival. One version of the story says he was literally in tears during the processing, overwhelmed by the weight of how far he had fallen. The arrest became a national headline, a tabloid punchline that stripped away the last of his dignity. But while the public was busy judging the mugshot, his body was already beginning to surrender. Just 3 months after that humiliating headline, the heart that once powered him high above the rim finally gave out. The passing of Orlando Woolridge in the spring of 2012 sent a ripple of quiet reflection through the basketball world. It was a moment that forced fans and former teammates to look past the headlines and remember the man who had actually lived the life. When word got out that he had transitioned while under hospice care, the narrative began to shift from the tragedy of his final months to the brilliance of his 13 seasons in the league. He was only 52 years old, a number that felt far too small for a man who had left such a massive footprint on the game during its most transformative decade. According to public obituaries, Orlando passed away on May 31, 2012, surrounded by family in his home state of Louisiana. In memorial interviews released in June 2012, former Bulls teammate John Paxson publicly highlighted Orlando's legacy, describing him as a good-natured spirit who simply had to battle fiercer demons than most. Public obituaries at the time focused on his role as a pioneer of the high-flying athletic style that defines the modern NBA. He was the prototype for the explosive forward, a man who proved that you could be a scoring machine while still playing with a flair that brought people into the arena. Reporters noted at the time that the tragedy of his life was not just in how it ended, but in how much of his greatness was obscured by the era he played in.